Hey, good morning, everyone. Welcome, or good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is for you, I guess. My name's Genevieve Bennett. We're really excited to have you here with us. I think we might wait just another moment or two to let a few more people trickle in. And in the meantime, if you are the rare person who somehow made it this far without ever being on a webinar before, I can go over a few logistics. So we've got a chat function at the bottom of your screen, and you can use that to chat with other panelists and introduce yourselves. It's always sort of fun to hear who's here and where they're from. And then there's also a Q&A function, and you can use that to submit questions for the panelists, and I will be keeping an eye on that, and we'll definitely make sure we have some time for Q&A at the end. We are hoping to kind of keep this discussion lively and dynamic rather than a lot of PowerPoint presentations. So please do have some questions for us. We have an awesome panel this morning. We have Dr. Tundia Gardi. We have Alex Procton, Tundia with SoundSeas, Alex Procton with Ecosystem Marketplace. We have Elizabeth Littlefield. We have Stephanie Simpson, and we have Juliana Castaño Isaza, and they're all going to introduce themselves in a moment, and I will let them do that. But I wanted to just sort of frame this out. You know, Ecosystem Marketplace tracks the entire voluntary carbon market, and we put out these annual State of the Voluntary Carbon Markets reports, as well as some briefings and white papers and analysis in between. And we recently did a State of the Blue Carbon Market report, and we don't usually do a full report on one credit category in the VCM, but we did for blue carbon, I think in part because it's a really interesting space. You hear a lot about the potential, and you hear also a lot about some of the challenges. And so we thought it was worth really taking a deep dive through the report and through, you know, sessions like this with all of these amazing experts we have to really kind of get our arms around, you know, what is the potential here, what is the opportunity, and how do we get there. And so I think to begin to answer those questions, I'm going to hand it over to Tundi, who is the lead author of the report, to frame it out for us a little bit. You know, what do we know about blue carbon? What is the potential? What are some of the challenges that we're seeing? You know, what did we learn in that report? And so let's see, let me share my screen now. And Tundi, if you'd like to introduce yourself briefly as well before you begin talking, that would be great.
Okay, well, thank you, Jen. I appreciate it. It's wonderful to be speaking to all of you and to be sharing this panel with some people who are not just experts in blue carbon, but also experts in making blue carbon crediting happen and taking big steps towards restoring blue carbon habitats and safeguarding them for the future. So as Jen mentioned, we worked on a State of the Blue Carbon report. This report was a follow-through from an earlier report that we had done for the World Bank at their request, looking for kind of trying to track what was going on with blue carbon markets, but also putting that into the context of what was happening with knowledge around blue carbon ecosystems, around the drivers of degradation, around the most powerful means for stemming degradation or restoring blue carbon habitats, also looking at the co-benefits. And so that's the basis of the report. The report was looking at kind of supply side in terms of blue carbon projects and initiatives that could be the basis for carbon credits. And it was also looking at the demand side. And if I could have the next slide, Jen. Thanks. Very much focused on the kind of most marketable kinds of blue carbon. So blue carbon ecosystems run the gamut from mangrove forests, which are kind of most analogous to forest carbon, obviously. These are salt water tolerant tree tree ecosystems, forest ecosystems located in many tropical and subtropical regions of the world. And the areas where there's been the most kind of traction in terms of understanding carbon sequestration potential, being able to verify carbon stocks and carbon sequestration in soils, and being able to generate credits. So blue carbon runs from these kind of more familiar types of carbon habitats all the way through to some very kind of innovative ways to look at carbon sequestration in the open ocean, for instance, whale carbon, phytoplankton carbon, and so forth. The report, obviously, because it is a state of the blue carbon markets, really focuses on three major kinds of blue carbon habitats. These are the mangroves, the seagrasses, and salt marshes. And there it does delve into a little bit of the potential for other kinds of blue carbon, like macroalgae or seaweeds, kelp forests, and so forth. But the focus is really on the big three. And this is where we've seen a lot of effort put into quantifying carbon sequestration, generating projects that can then provide credits, and also where we see countries with their nationally determined contributions listing blue carbon habitats. And this will be especially the case, I think, in the coming round of NDCs in 2025. So there is a lot of excitement still about blue carbon. And as Alex will speak to in a minute, there's been a lot of volatility in the blue carbon market. So there was initially a lot of interest. If I could have the next slide, Jen. Initially, a lot of interest in blue carbon. We actually, and I apologize, I realize I didn't introduce myself. So let me just say that I am a marine ecologist, and I worked with Forest Trends for many years, running the Marine Ecosystem Services program. And while I was at Forest Trends, we held a Katoomba group meeting to look at marine ecosystems and marine market possibilities. And this was quite a long time ago. And there was, at that time, there were no blue carbon credits whatsoever. And at that time, there was a lot of interest in marine ecosystems providing carbon sequestration, but also other ecosystem services. And there was a lot of excitement in the investor community also about trying to look at blue carbon habitats for generating carbon credits and carbon offsets, but then also just the beginnings of speaking about biodiversity credits and other kinds of credits generated from these ecosystems that are providing so many ecosystem services. So since that time, and that's been in the last, I would say 12 years, there's been a huge amount of volatility in the market. Alex will talk about pricing, the fact that the blue carbon market is still around less, I think, than 1% of all of the carbon market trading that's going on. Huge amount of price volatility. What we're seeing now is blue carbon being considered as a credit generator, but also as a co-benefit to other kinds of market mechanisms that are being used to safeguard these ecosystems. So particularly with respect to mangroves and seagrass, what we're seeing is a real focus on what do these ecosystems do for us, and how can we capitalize some of those services and use the funds generated to support long-term recovery and protection of these ecosystems. Interestingly, the COP29 came up with these new carbon market standards, which will, it is hoped, reduce some of the nervousness in the market about the quality of these credits, and will also reduce investor risk, reputational risk, and otherwise, ensuring that the blue carbon and all carbon credits that are generated are viable and are true to their market. Next slide. So if I'm just going to end here because I really want to spend the time having a discussion with the practitioners in the field and also talking about what may lie ahead in terms of blue carbon markets. Just to say that there's been a lot of interest in coupling carbon credits to other kinds of credits, so such as biodiversity credits. There's been a lot of guidance that's come out from things like the International Blue Carbon Initiative and the Blue Carbon Scientific Working Group, things like Mangrove Breakthrough and other initiatives. And the State of the Blue Carbon Market report lists some of these initiatives and documents and knowledge products that have come out that are kind of guiding not only blue carbon investment, but also guiding coupling of, for instance, biodiversity credits with blue carbon credits. So there's a lot out there, a lot of knowledge being generated and shared. There's a lot of initiatives on the part of the World Bank, which you'll hear more about from Juliana, about making blue carbon more investable and increasing the capacity of countries to be able to take on blue carbon and use the credits generated for conservation and restoration. So there's a lot of activity out there. And it's a very, very exciting time, again, to be involved with blue carbon. And as we'll hear from our other speakers, we've seen a lot of success with blue carbon projects on the ground, and a lot of signals from investors that blue carbon might be on the brink of really coming to scale around the world. So with that, I think I'll hand it over to Alex, who can talk through some of the details of where we are with the blue carbon market at the moment. Thank you.
Thanks, Cindy. And briefly, my background, I studied conservation biology, and then my professional background has been working as a data scientist, previously with commodities. So that's where my experience with market data has come in. Now I've been at Ecosystem Marketplace working with the carbon market data that we receive from carbon project developers and other actors in the carbon market space. So exciting to be able to give some context as well to the data that Tundi has as part of the report. Figure out how to share it. Jen, I think that you have to let me share. Great. So, so I wanted to give a little bit more context to the blue carbon data.
Hey, Alex.
Yes.
I can't see your screen.
You cannot see it? I'll just share it like this. Can you see it now?
I cannot. Can others? There it is. Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Great. I wanted to give some context to the data that was shared in the report. As Tundi said, the blue carbon category can seem a little bit volatile and jumpy. And within the blue carbon category, Ecosystem Marketplace considers a couple of different project types to make up this category of credits. So we have mangrove restoration projects, is sort of very typical, what you would think of as a blue carbon project. We also have wetland restoration projects. So these would be more based on land. We also have afforestation and reforestation. So this is a typical nature-based credit type. We have some of those projects that also include wetland restoration as part of that. And then finally, there's a seagrass restoration category, but we haven't received any transactions from the seagrass restoration category over the last 4 years. So it's really a very nascent category, very small. And so what I've done here is broken down the data into mangrove restoration and these more terrestrial-based blue carbon projects. And you can see where some of this discontinuity and jumpiness within the blue carbon category comes from in terms of the price of these credits. So both of these credit types, the average value of the credits has increased. But for mangrove restoration, it's increased, almost 200% since 2021. Overall, what we've seen over the last 2 years in the market is that the volume and the price of credit transactions in 2021 and 2022 really increased. There was a little bit of a pullback from this in 2023. And that's really, I think, related a lot to some global macroeconomic conditions, as well within the nature-based category, to some scrutiny from some of the popular project types like Red Plus. And so I think that we saw that affecting across the board, across carbon markets and across nature-based solutions. But it's important to look at this context where, in 2023, both terrestrial and marine-based blue carbon credits are retailing for much more than they were retailing for in 2021 and before. The second thing, and this is where, there can be some confusion sometimes looking at the data that we publish in our annual reports, that the average price of blue carbon credits overall is less than $10 per ton. Well, the average price for a mangrove restoration credit is $26 per ton in 2023, but it only makes up 3% of the volume of the blue carbon credits that were traded and reported to Ecosystem Marketplace. So I think that a discussion that is on all of our minds and something that came out of the discussions that we had leading up to this webinar was, how can mangrove credits differentiate themselves, and the additional benefits that exist for mangrove restoration with regards to biodiversity, with regards to the health of marine ecosystems. How can that actually be properly valued, and how can that be incorporated into the calculation of the value of these credits, so that there's an understanding, and clearly there's a willingness for sophisticated buyers to pay $26 per ton, or else these credits wouldn't have sold for that much in 2022 and 2023. But to expand the benefits for mangrove ecosystems, how can we share that understanding of those benefits and share how these co-benefits that exist in this type of carbon credit really deserve to be valued at this level? And that's something that we're seeing across the carbon market. And I think mangroves and blue carbon is an excellent example. And so I'll hand it over to more of a discussion with the practitioners in the field. But I wanted to end with a promotion for our Global Carbon Markets Hub, which we recently upgraded, launched a version that's available to the public. And for our respondents receive exclusive dashboards that go beyond what's available to the public, including up-to-date data. We're currently collecting data from 2024 on carbon market transactions that will be published in the spring of 2025. So if you are developing projects or transacting these credits in any way, please reach out to us at info@ecosystemmarketplace.com.
Thanks, Alex. And just we are aware that the chat is not working for attendees. I apologize for that. That was not intentional. I'll see if I can fix it without accidentally kicking everybody out of the webinar or something awful. But while I do that, I'd love to have the rest of our panelists briefly introduce themselves. Who you are and how you got here. Why are you working in this space? Like what really excites you about blue carbon? So if you could just quickly do that, we'll start with Elizabeth Littlefield, Senior Partner at West Africa Blue, and then Stephanie Simpson, who is the Senior Blue Carbon Manager at the Nature Conservancy, and then Juliana Castaña Isasa, who's a Marine Natural Resources Management Specialist at the World Bank. So Elizabeth, welcome.
Yeah, thanks, Jen. And it's great to see you guys all. Yeah, my immediate background is just during the Obama administration, I was the CEO of OPIC, now known as DFC, for 7 years. Prior to that, I was at I worked at the World Bank actually as the Director of Private Sector Development and also of CGAP, which was the organization that focused on financial inclusion, particularly for IPLCs. And before that, I was at JP Morgan for a million years, running emerging markets things, but always working in the poor countries of the world. And I guess my passion has really always been how local communities and nature can survive together, because so often their objectives are seen at odds with one another, particularly in Africa. So in 2021, I co-funded a social enterprise called West Africa Blue, with partners who had been actually living and working in West Africa with communities that we're not working with for over 14 years. So the bedrock of our work is really in those relationships, of very trusting relationships with the communities. And the mission of the organization is really to basically protect and restore coastal ecosystems while enhancing the livelihoods of those communities and the biodiversity that's there. And then to permanently and sustainably finance that through the sale of carbon credits. We're also doing a whole bunch of learning and sharing, open source and transparent offerings or benefit sharing agreement and a few things like that haven't been done before. And it's just super gratifying to see our two first projects, blue carbon projects, are now kind of up and running, 90,000 hectares, a group project. So we've just started with the first area in Sierra Leone and another 35,000 hectare project in Guinea, both kind of up and running, and really powerful to see the communities, how incredibly jazzed up and empowered and excited they are about all the activities of the project. And I mean, it's been hard as hell, I have to say, but I think we've got a theory of change that works, and that people seem to be engaged in and excited. And so we're making good progress. And I'm happy to share with you subsequently what that simple theory of change is and what we've learned and what mistakes we've made. Thanks.
Thank you, Stephanie. Over to you.
Hi, everyone. Yes, I'm Steph Simpson. I'm the Senior Blue Carbon Manager for the Nature Conservancy. We are an environmental nonprofit with programs in over 80 countries across the globe. My background specifically is in environmental science and management, with a focus on coastal systems and processes. I'm also a returned Peace Corps volunteer. That was a very influential experience for me, working cross-culturally with communities on the sustainable development or sustainable management of coastal ecosystems. And I've been working in the field of blue carbon for over the past decade now. It's really an amazing field to be working in. It's challenging, but it's at this nexus of coastal habitat restoration and management needs, and also climate change as a nature-based solution. And my role at the Nature Conservancy is to support our state and country programs to scope out and develop climate finance projects for coastal wetland blue carbon ecosystems. And similar, to kind of the notes that Elizabeth mentioned, I mean, I really enjoy the most that aspect of my job is working with our different country programs and partners, our field teams on the ground, working within these systems, trying to bring in more resources for them. I grew up in a coastal state in the U.S., and so it's also very very passionate from myself as well to be investing my time and resources and knowledge and understanding these ecosystems and trying to provide more resources for them. They're really amazingly productive ecosystems, but also they're very challenged landscapes because so much of our world lives within the coastal landscape, and so we are impacting them. really amazing to be working in this field, and looking forward to sharing more insights and learning from my panelists today.
Beautiful, thank you. And then, of course, Juliana.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jen, and thank you all for joining. I am Juliana Castaño. I'm a natural resources management specialist with the World Bank's Eastern and Southern Africa region. I recently transitioned from my previous role at the ProBlue Secretariat, which is a multi-donor trust fund with over $250 million in financing, supporting about 300 activities worldwide. And during my time at ProBlue, I had the privilege of leading analytical and knowledge initiatives on blue carbon, the one that Tundi shared a few minutes ago, as well as the marine spatial planning and marine biodiversity and gender. So about my background, I'm a biologist, and I also studied international sustainable development. And right when I was doing my master's thesis, I had the privilege to work with forest trends. So I'm really honored to be here after so many years. It's been almost 15 years. I worked with Tundi, Michael Jenkins, and others. I had the privilege of working on payment for ecosystem services for beach restoration and conservation, which wasn't specifically on blue carbon, but just the understanding of what comes behind this type of market-based mechanisms was truly amazing. Like all the policy aspects, the data, and how to engage the local communities, how to set the value for these ecosystem services. And then later on, I worked at the Nature Conservancy in the Eastern Caribbean program, where I worked more closely with the communities on mangroves, but it was more about the adaptation side on nature-based solutions for risk reduction and adaptation in coastal areas. And that has been mostly my work for the last 10 years with the bank. But then I had the opportunity to work on blue carbon, developing a readiness framework that is also the one that Tundi presented. So for the last couple of years, we have been developing and implementing this work in a few countries, and I'll be happy to share with you more about it later on. So thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody. We have such a great panel here. I kind of don't know where to start with questions, but I think I'm going to Elizabeth, you mentioned landing on a theory of change that works. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that in the context of your project, and also what's been so hard. You mentioned some challenges as well.
Sure. How much time do you have? No.
Yeah. The abbreviated version.
Yeah, no, I'm kidding. So, I think well, the good news is one of the only challenges that we don't have in West Africa is a tourism threat, which of course is a threat for mangrove ecosystems in most parts of the world. It's definitely not one in this area because it's very, very remote. But basically along this coastal area are extremely poor communities with very low levels of literacy and high levels of malnutrition. And their subsistence economy was basically fishing. But of course, like so many other areas, the area has been plagued with illegal and unreported fishing. The so-called marine protected area there in large parts of the estuary where we're working is a paper park. It's no protection whatsoever happening. And so the fishing stocks having been drastically depleted, the communities are now turning to harvesting the mangroves for cooking, for smoking fish, for construction, and for sale. So we kind of set about to figure out, okay, well, these are really smart people who've been doing this for generations. If there was an easy way around this, they would have figured it out. But maybe with a little help and working closely with them, we can find ways to reduce the deforestation that was quite significant in that part of the world. I won't go into the data there, but there's been very rapid deforestation of mangroves in the whole coast, actually. which I think Tundi knows better than anyone. So yeah, number one was to reduce the use of wood for cooking. So we introduced cook stoves. There's no way we could import them, the normal metal ones you see. So we have homemade ones that the communities are making themselves out of mud and clay and other stuff. And we've now got about 2,600 of them up and running that have weathered 2 rainy seasons, and the communities are super psyched about them. And already the kitchen performance tests suggest that they're reducing wood use by about 70%,
Wow.
which is incredible, right? And because that's not just reducing the wood use from what they would have been using on the big 3-stone fires, but it's also sustainably harvested because it's little sticks and twigs being put into an oven rather than the big logs burning that necessarily kill the tree when you cut them down. So that's for fish for the cooking. For fish smoking, we're developing a new improved fish smoking oven, which will have imported parts, some metal parts. And that I think promises to reduce wood use by even more, because the amount of wood that goes into smoking fish for preservation, since there's no cold storage possible, is huge. And so I think those 2 things alone will make an enormous difference, and are already doing so. In terms of, so that's for cooking. And for smoking, we've had a little bit more of a struggle on finding replacement for construction. But there we built wood lots around nearby each settlements, with both fast growing wood for construction like bamboo and Relina, but also fruit trees that people can use in the interim as a motivation to take care of the area, and then while the construction wood grows. And then for livelihoods, we have a bunch of other things in terms of what replacing the sale. A number of things. One of them looks promising so far, but I can't say it's actually generated a ton of income yet. And that is changing oyster farming from what they're doing now, which is growing the oysters on the roots of the mangrove trees and then cutting the root to harvest the oysters, and instead using bamboo racks across the river, which people are super excited about, and the women can do it by themselves. And there's all these competitions going on, and it's garnered a lot of excitement. And then, of course, alongside that is an enormous amount of employment. We're paying in some form or another. I won't call them employees because obviously you can't call them employees, but we've got contracts with probably at this point maybe 400 or 500 people that it's the first income they've ever received in cash. So that's helping a lot too. So that's been kind of the theory of change. It seems to be working. We're testing right now to see whether it has worked enough for us to issue credits next year. But I mean, obviously the challenges that go with that are enormous. We've done FPIC, 6 different modules, 2 days each, in 120 villages that can be reached by boat only. So they're very remote, in multiple languages. So the logistics is quite enormous. As you all know, working in blue carbon, nothing is as simple as a terrestrial forest. Sometimes I dream I've died and gone to heaven and woken up doing a terrestrial project. It wouldn't be anywhere near as exciting or have the impact. I'll just mention one last thing, and that is on the biodiversity side. We've done some really great partnerships with Nature Metrics and others to measure with the biodiversity that's there, and found a lot of species nobody knew was in the area. And we'll be tracking some really interesting ones that are going to be very telling about the health of the mangrove ecosystems. I could keep going. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you. I think maybe we're going to do a lightning round now. All of the other panelists, I would love to hear, very, very briefly, if you could snap your fingers and do one thing to help project developers overcome some of the challenges that they're facing, the things Elizabeth talked about, Tundi mentioned, high upfront costs of these projects. I think there are probably a lot of other pieces too. What would you do? Lightning round. Steph, we'll start with you.
Wow. I mean, I think there's many challenges, right, to getting these projects up and going and really investing in enabling conditions. So I'm not going to say finance, because I think that's too too obvious, maybe, that you need finance to support these. But I think I might I want to say two things, because there's two really big things I think that could really help. And those are science and strong collaborations. And this is coming from, I'm thinking about actually one of our projects that is also moving successfully through project stages, and that's in Virginia seagrass restoration project. So hopefully we'll soon have the first seagrass blue carbon credits issued as that project works its way through. But two of the really big reasons why that project has been successful is one is in the investment in science. In Virginia, there's been between the University of Virginia and the Virginia Institute of Marine Science, there have been there's a long-term ecological monitoring program out of UVA, and there's annual seagrass bed surveys. So there's a lot of monitoring already happening. There's a lot of science into, actually going out and collecting data on the sequestration rate of seagrass once it's being restored. And so having that local science is really huge. And being able to invest in that is a big need. So where that science doesn't exist, which is in a lot of places, you need to be able to, not just invest in that science, but use that as a point to also increase capacity on the ground with local partners. So it's working with local universities, with relevant agencies, with communities, to train them how to do baseline assessment and monitoring, including field surveys, the use of remote sensing data, collection of carbon cores, lab analysis, all of that. And then the second thing that I mentioned, right, is kind of relationships, collaboration. And again, we look at Virginia, there was already a very strong existing relationships between the state and university and nonprofit partners to help coordinate restoration and monitoring. And these projects, as Elizabeth also, alluded to, require a lot of collaboration. There's a lot of stakeholders. And so in many places where we work, we do see ourselves at TNC as a collaborator. It's not always the flashy role to fill, but it's really critical to have a collaborator who can help bring in resources, help identify the expertise that's available, organize, partners towards this common goal, building enabling conditions for market project development, listing, and success. So I think those are kind of, so I gave you two answers instead of one.
All right, we'll let it slide. Thank you. That was great. Juliana, what would you add to that? How do we help
Thank
project?
you. Well, yeah, it's a bit difficult to add to what Elizabeth and Stephanie already said, but I would say three specific things. In my view, we should have an integrated approach. So as investors, I would recommend not seeing this as like a piecemeal approach that is only carbon. To me, this is very damaging. Just thinking that blue carbon is like the sole instrument for coastal ecosystems, and that's why I wanted to bring the importance of integrated planning, like marine spatial planning, integrated coastal management, and others, because that's what brings the allocation of space and resources for the different uses. So if people are able to have like this integrated strategy, they can allocate these areas where the government might be spending on restoration approaches, but maybe the port will also do restoration, and then you can have a better connectivity and therefore increase like kind of a jurisdictional approach to blue carbon. So that's one. The second thing is addressing the land tenure issues. So this is probably not for the project developer itself, but more for the government. This has been one of the main obstacles we have seen over the last years, especially along the coast in mangrove areas where this tenure is even harder. So clarifying the tenure, not only land tenure, but also the carbon tenure is critical, because then at the end, the benefit sharing will be diminished if this is not clear. And finally is the transparency side. And this is also related to the land tenure. But the transparency, not in terms of the tenure, but also if the government is giving out a concession, if it's for blue carbon or even any activity that is happening along the coast, people should know about these agreements, and they should know how much taxes the government is receiving from those concessions, and how the government is reinvesting this in the local communities, because this is something that I understand that the private sector from our IFC colleagues are struggling with, is just having this transparency that will de-risk the investments of the private sector. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you. That was a really, I think, good reminder of sort of the bigger picture context in which these projects are working. And I want to pick up on what you said about an integrated approach, Juliana, because, I think we've been hearing, the pricing is volatile. These projects have a lot of benefits for biodiversity, for livelihoods. And so there maybe are some opportunities to really link with other financial instruments, right? And I see there's a question in the chat as well, sort of, centered on this question of like, is blue carbon like really going to be a silver bullet, or is it part of a bigger set of strategies that we need to be thinking about? And so I might ask the panelists, I think Juliana mentioned almost sort of a jurisdictional approach to blue carbon, and that was something that you wrote about, Tundi, in the report. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, and then ask the other panelists after that, is there anything you are all working on as far as, linking up with different financing instruments that you're adding on to the blue carbon play? And if you can tell us about that and sort of what the theory of change is there. So Tundi, to you, please.
Thanks, Jen. Yeah, so we were struck in reviewing kind of the state of the blue carbon markets, and not just the state of the blue carbon markets, but how actually blue carbon ecosystems were being valued for various purposes, not just blue carbon credit generation, but also potentially biodiversity credit generation, water quality trading schemes, and those kind of market approaches. Juliana mentioned her work in PES, but marine payments for ecosystem services. So all kinds of ways of valuing the ecosystem services coming out of blue carbon habitats was leading, on the one hand, to interest in the private sector and investor side, in looking at the viability of credits, but also leading to interest in the government side and in jurisdictional approaches. And we kind of landed on a recommendation that kind of blended finance and kind of keeping the big picture in mind, while at the same time looking for opportunities for project level demonstrations of carbon credit generation would make a lot of sense. And Juliana mentioned the enabling conditions and the fact that marine spatial planning and other frameworks are allowing for the identification of the habitats with the most potential to be able to generate various kinds of credits and various kinds of values. And now with the movement towards kind of being more broad and inclusive in the NDC calculations coming up, that there are more and more opportunities for kind of creating a mix of private sector investment and jurisdictional approaches, REDD+ or whatever. So there's a lot of potential. I do want to say one thing, that projects, the project level blue carbon generation, credit generation is critically important, not only for demonstrating the viability of the financing tool, but also for moving the needle on the enabling conditions, that governments are taking notice of this kind of investment and recognizing more and more the value of blue carbon and blue carbon habitats for the other ecosystem services that they provide. And this is probably, I mean, I'm hopeful, we've talked about this a lot at Forest Trends and Ecosystem Marketplace about the potential for stacking and how can that be done well and legitimately. But I think this two-way flow from projects being able to demonstrate the viability of carbon credits coming out of these ecosystems, and then also changing the enabling conditions slowly over time to make it more risk-free, as Juliana mentioned, and make it a better environment for investors to come in is really important. But I will turn it over. I think you asked for theory of change from the practitioners on the ground rather than people like me who sit and attach a computer and synthesize other people's findings. So
we all think that you are very important. But yeah, I am curious, Elizabeth and Stephanie, I know that you both of you, your organizations are sort of experimenting with some other ways to link financing, and I wonder if you could speak to those. Elizabeth, let's have you go first again. We'll keep going around.
I was just going to defer to Steph, but anyway, yes. Maybe just two quick things on that. I mean, from some financing instruments, obviously, I mean, one of the ones that's been most useful to us is a sort of a revenue share agreement where you get money up front and then pay back once credits are received. I think that's becoming more common, but that's certainly been one of the instruments that's been best adapted to the cash flows of these projects. Another one that we've done, and I was very proud to work with my former colleagues at DFC on this, it was a political risk insurance cover, which exactly met the needs of some of our early impact investors who'd never invested in emerging markets, much less Africa, much less West Africa. So that was a very important instrument that covered, a range of things from expropriation to political violence to the inability to repatriate your dividends. So really useful tool there. And let me know if you want an introduction of any kind. But the other one that just sort of doesn't quite fall into financing instruments per se, but that is this whole idea of that I've been pushing, which is the need for a transparent benefit sharing agreement. For me, it is unconscionable that the benefit sharing agreements across the market, not just blue carbon, are totally unavailable and opaque. And if you get your hands on one, it's pretty shocking what's in there in terms of, the fine lines, the fine print that communities not be possibly expected to understand. And some of them are just downright unfair. So for me, one of the things that we're hoping to contribute and would love to be joined by others, and that is a full disclosure of a benefit sharing agreement with no hidden nothing. So I feel if the market can move in the direction of standards and transparency around things like that, that would do a lot to calming the criticism, but also creating more clarity around who's getting what and when from these revenue flows. And I guess that leads to, for me, the biggest challenge, if you really boil it all down, is the real challenge is coming up to an agreement on what's fair. What are the investors, what's fair for the investors to receive to take the risks they're taking, what's fair for the government to receive sometimes and they don't even own the land or aren't providing any services, but it's their country, what's fair for a developer to be remunerated for the risks it's taking, and then of course what's fair for the communities who are doing all the work and taking all the risk and on whose land this work is often being done. And I bet the problem is we have completely different idea about what's fair, and it's the public sector and the private sector have very different views also on what kind of policies in place. I mean, I don't know how often we're thinking at the Article 6 Paris Club level of the implications of policy decisions for what the attractiveness of the offering then becomes for private sector investors who need to grow this market. So that kind of crosswalk about what's fair and transparency around it, to me, is one of the most important things that we need to get done to move this thing forward at the speed that it has to go.
Thank you. Steph, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Sure, yeah. I mean, first, just kind of echoing what Elizabeth said, I mean, transparency around benefit sharing agreement, that is definitely something that's sorely needed. I think going back to kind of thinking about some of these different financial mechanisms or emerging mechanisms such as biodiversity credits. We're also working at the Nature Conservancy around coastal resilience credits as another ecosystem service that we know these ecosystems, namely mangroves and tidal marsh, are providing and help reduce the flood risk to communities. And so valuing that, adding that as another benefit that can be stacked along with carbon offsets. There's also other kind of larger finance mechanisms in the works. You see, nature or blue bonds being released, being developed in a lot of countries. There's also, someone mentioned earlier, the Mangrove Breakthrough, the Mangrove Breakthrough's financial roadmap, which is a goal of mobilizing $4 billion to conserve and restore mangroves globally. And the Global Mangrove Alliance is the implementing arm of that. So I would encourage, those who are working in mangroves to be part of the GMA. If you're not already, there are 84 members across the world and 13 country chapters. So there is an extensive reach through the GMA. But I think, we talk about the stacking of credits and those emerging market mechanisms. I think the reality still is, because these projects are high risk, that a blended finance approach is needed, and that we still require, as far as upfront funding, a lot of that to be philanthropic. Because it does take time to develop projects, to work with communities, to work out through all of these challenges, the politics, government support, land tenure, building the science. And the truth is that if buyers want to have carbon credits, blue carbon credits in the future to purchase, then there is a need to invest in those projects up front, financing those projects now so that there are credits available in the future. And so I think that's also kind of, just the reality of it is we still are very reliant on those philanthropic gifts. Those are really, really important to really catalyze blue carbon project development and be able to build out a true project pipeline for credits to be available in the future.
Awesome. All right, we've got 7 more minutes, so we're gonna get through some of these questions in the chat. And we've been talking about finance, so let's stay there for a moment. So we've got a question: how is the typical blue carbon project being financed, if there is a typical one? I mean, Steph, you just mentioned there's a lot of reliance on philanthropic support. Elizabeth, I think you probably can speak to this, and if any other of the panelists want to jump in, what do we see being kind of a common model for financing projects, and are there maybe some directions of travel that you think the field ought to go? So I will, Elizabeth.
Very, very quickly then, yeah, I mean, some developers and others have backers that have deep pockets, and that's the easiest way to go, I would say. Others with less resources are required to pre-sell, but that pre-selling, because it means you're shifting the risk to the buyer, it oftentimes comes with a pretty deep discount, which means that the communities and the government and everybody's getting less at the end of the day. So that deep discount can be punishing. And then others have different structures that I've mentioned earlier, but mostly the goal, of course, is to stack, started with as much concessional or grant money as one can, if one's trying to do something special for the market or be catalytic, and then move up from that to concessional capital, then pre-sales, and then ultimately commercial capital.
Great. Juliana, I see you've got your hand up.
Thank you. Well, I guess from the World Bank perspective, I wanted to give you some ideas on how we are approaching this. So right now we are using trust funds like ProBlue or others that will help us with the readiness of the country to access the carbon markets or access the results-based carbon finance, like FCPF, Biocarbon Fund, or Biocarbon Fund probably not, but Scale, that is the new facility on carbon finance. So ProBlue, for example, supports the government on understanding what's the data availability, everything that has to be with data and analytics for blue carbon, then the policy and institutional arrangements, and finally the finance required or the finance streams that they have for blue carbon development. But I also wanted to bring 2 more things. As we were talking about integrated planning, I think it's very important to understand where blue carbon is more like the most like optimal approach. sometimes we have mangrove areas that perhaps don't have a lot of mangrove storage, but they provide a lot of coastal protection. And there is where, as Elizabeth was telling us, like the insurance sector will probably provide a better deal, but the overall objective at the end is conserving and restoring mangroves, right? So regardless of the mechanism, I think it's worth exploring the different instruments. And then finally, what we're doing, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, and also linked to Elizabeth's point, I would suggest, and this is what we're doing, for example, in Mozambique, identifying the value chains to be developed in blue carbon ecosystems. And the reason behind is because we don't want to see the green colonialism, as probably you have all heard. So we want to bring the skills for the communities to access better jobs. And in this case, we want to link these value chains if they are developing, I don't know, honey in the mangrove areas, or sea cucumber we are exploring in Mozambique in the seagrass beds, so they can have access to markets and therefore guaranteeing income for these communities. Thank you.
Thank you. It looks like we've got time for one more question. I do want to say thank you to Alex, who has been responding to some of the questions in the data directly in the Q&A. And so you can all take a look at that. But we have a question that I thought was interesting, and I'm going to rephrase it a little bit. But how is tech changing the space and data? Because we've talked about the need for better science. We've talked about transparency. I wonder if any of you have any stories about, whether it is like distributed ledgers like blockchain or using AI to improve data and science. Do we have any stories or thoughts there? I'll let everybody just step up if they've got anything.
I can just jump. I can't say anything about blockchain. I can't get my head around that. It shows from my age. But anyway, I think tech approaches to help us in this regard, being able to track, to understand what the potential is for what the habitat coverage is and the condition of habitats around the world, recognizing that many of these blue carbon ecosystems are hidden by a blanket of ocean water or are in areas that are largely inaccessible, that we now have remote sensing and combined with AI in terms of the analysis of remote sensing data to better understand the condition of the distribution, the condition of these blue carbon habitats. So where is their potential to come to scale? And what are also the trends in condition over time? So where are there areas that are seemingly holding on and resilient to climate change and other influences, which we haven't talked about, but it is one of the features of blue carbon that is certainly not unique to blue carbon, but something to be aware of is how much climate change is influencing the ability of these ecosystems to sequester carbon. So I think that's one area where tech is helping. Maybe some of the other people can look at it more from the financial instrument side and where the tech has helped in terms of the market, understanding the market. Anybody? Any final thoughts there?
I might mention, I mean, I agree with everything Tundi just said. I mean, the remote sensing and AI, we need more progress with that. And I think there's already been a lot of progress made to be able to identify the magnitude and scoping out where projects could happen and classifying the different species compositions. That's really important. As far as financial side, I will say we are working on a blue carbon cost tool that we hope to be launching later next year, because that's something we don't have a lot of standardized data around what is the true cost to developing blue carbon projects. You know, there's papers out there, you look at them, their numbers are all over the place, and you try to look at, you know, where those numbers came from, and they're not reported consistently. So to have and what we're trying to do with the blue carbon cost tool is provide a consistent way to think about the cost that actually go into projects, to get them up running, to maintain them. You know, then it makes it, you know, helpful. Then we can project out what are potential carbon revenues. What does that price point need to be to make this project truly sustainable? So we're hoping that this tool, it can help. We have limited data that's into it. What we really need is more data into it, right? We need to be working together as project developers and collaborators and sharing that kind of data in a more systemized way. And I think that you know, hopefully that can really help, not just on the project development side, but on the project investor side as well.
Thanks, Steph. Yeah, I worked with some of your colleagues at TNC, Dan Shemy and his team on something similar on the terrestrial side for watershed restoration. And I think it's these kinds of tools where they're really built on project developer data can be just unbelievably useful. So I would definitely encourage you all to work with TNC on that. I think we are going to wrap. We're at time, but we will be sending around webinar recordings, some resources, reports that were mentioned in this session, and you know, more information on the Mangrove Alliance and pieces like that. And thank you all for coming. I thought that this was super interesting. I'm personally. And thank you to our panelists for making the time and all of your insights and all of your great work that you're doing.
And thanks to Ecosystem Marketplace for organizing and for showing the interest.
Yeah. Thanks for the great report.
Thank
Cindy
you. Yes.
and Jen.
Thanks.
everyone.
Invitation.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.